I'm Alexander Rose, the Executive Director here at Long Now. I'm going to be joined here at the Interval in San Francisco by our speaker today, Prerna Singh, who comes to us through a partnership that we have had for several years with CASBIS, the Center for Advanced Studies in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. Prerna has been studying virology, pandemics, nationalism, and most importantly at this point, vaccine acceptance and how all these things come together. And tonight she's going to give us a history of that, as well as how it might apply to our present situation here in our own pandemic. Welcome, Prerna Singh.
Thank you, Xander. It's an honor to be here at the Long Now Foundation. And in my research, I look to the past to understand how to promote human flourishing today and in the future. And in that, I see my aims as very much in alignment with the goals of the foundation. So infectious diseases have posed one of the most serious and long-standing challenges to humankind. Especially since settled agriculture and the domestication of animals, infectious diseases have not only been the single largest cause of human morbidity and mortality, they've also generated enormous social tumult, triggering the economic reversals of fortunes and the collapse of once mighty political empires, and decisively shaped the trajectory of world history. In the past couple of centuries, but especially in the 20th century, we have made unprecedented medical advances in research and treatments, and yet COVID-19 is a stark reminder of the grave threat that we continue to face from a host of deadly diseases, naturally occurring, but also the use of germs as a tool of bioterrorism. For me as a social scientist, the control of infectious disease represents a fertile and yet relatively underexplored site of interactions between the state and its people. So historically, the control of disease has been an important driving force for the development of states as we think of them today. So Charles Tilly famously argued that wars make states. And yet, historians have shown that inasmuch as military conflict, it was war against an often more deadly foe than an enemy army, disease that prompted the extension of the state into previously autonomous social domains. On the one hand, contagion prompted the development of institutions of control, civilian law enforcement agencies, police, customs, migration, intelligence services, quarantines, and pandemics led to the establishment and strengthening of health bureaucracies, city health boards that marked the exertion of unprecedented state power over societal actors like the church. City boards regularly overruled the clergy in prohibiting festivals, processions, and gatherings. On the other hand, contagion also encouraged the development of institutions of care, such as poor laws, relief for the needy, that underlay the emergence of welfare states. The control of disease and healthcare in general thus gradually went from being a private realm, dominated by religious and kinship-based organizations, to being recognized as within the jurisdiction of, and then also a key responsibility of a state towards its people. So Roosevelt famously said that the success or failure of any government in the final analysis must be measured by the health of its citizens. And key to this is the protection against disease. But if we think of conceptualizing how capable states are in terms of how effectively they control infectious disease, it's important to recognize that this is a particular type of state capacity that rests critically on a state's ability to gain compliance with society. So let's think for a second of the typology of the kinds of activities that states regularly undertake. On the left, you have tasks that states can achieve without much active participation from society: economic planning, the dispensation of justice, building of public infrastructure. On the right, on the other hand, are activities that states cannot be successful at without the compliance of society. So the best organized elections are only successful if people vote. Volunteer armies can only be raised if people join them. A state's tax base, often its main source of revenue, rests on people willingly, fairly paying taxes. A state's public health policy is only as successful as the extent to which people comply with it. Historically, states have elicited compliance with their policies on this rough spectrum from coercive to voluntary. On the coercive end, forcible inspection, raiding of homes, separations of patients from families, segregation of contacts, compulsory sterilization, compulsory vaccination laws that may or may not be accompanied by force. But such coercion is far from ideal. It's costly to implement. You need to have information. You need to monitor and punish those who are evading. And further, coercion risks societal pushback. Through much of history, people have gone to great lengths to resist public health mandates. In India, colonial reports document how families hid plague victims in lofts, in cupboards, in gardens. In addition to such evasion, across much of the world, coercive public health policies have provoked protests, uprisings, violent riots, even assaults on and the assassinations of state employees. Moving across the spectrum away from coercion, many states stop short of making vaccines compulsory, but they may require them for access to state resources, schooling, employment. And at the very end of this scale, we can think of compliance with public health interventions that is voluntary, willingly extended. This is the most desired type of compliance, but it is also the most elusive. It represents a category within state tasks that require popular participation that, following a group of fellow New England economists, I call wicked hard. So for one, public health is preventive. Unlike when we take a pharmaceutical drug like a painkiller, we are not sick or suffering when we undertake a public health intervention. We are taking that action preemptively to protect us in the future. And we know from many studies that humans tend to be presentist. We discount the future. Public health advice can, because of its link to science, be dynamic and also possibly contradictory. This can be hard to process. And further, public health interventions require behavioral change. Behavioral change that is intense and it is intimate. Therefore, Michel Foucault's term biopower. Public health directives entail incursions, testing, incisions into our bodies and those of our often very young children, changes to our everyday established habits and routines, don't smoke, exercise, wear a condom. Public health directives can, as the COVID pandemic has reminded us, upend how we live. They can change how we die, alone or with our families. They can modify the rituals through which our loved ones remember us and send us onwards. In doing so, they can rub against often long-held norms, beliefs, and practices. They can challenge ways of seeing and being in the world, and they can lead us to question who we are, what we know, and our place in this universe. Compliance with many public health directives, such as vaccination, like some of those other tasks in the second column, voting, taxation, conscription, they represent what we call collective action problems. So although society is better off if all comply with their tax duties, each individual has an incentive to free ride on the contribution of others. Similarly for vaccination. Collective action is necessary to attain herd immunity, but once it is reached, the benefits of decreased mortality and morbidity are available to all. So given that, like almost all health interventions, vaccines entail some risks, a poke, some side effects, individuals have an incentive to enjoy the benefits of that common good, to take advantage of this positive externality of herd immunity conferred on them by others' decisions to vaccinate without themselves bearing any of those costs. So how then do you encourage compliance with such a wicked hard task? In this next part of the talk, I'll try to answer this question by taking you on a journey of how the world's first ever vaccine was received in two of the largest nations and oldest civilizations in the world, China and India. Vaccines have been hailed as the single most important intervention in public health. Immunization against infectious diseases has protected more children and adults from untimely deaths than any other form of treatment. The world's first vaccine was against smallpox, one of the oldest and deadliest diseases to afflict mankind. It claimed about 1 in 3 lives that often left survivors blinded and almost certainly disfigured, faces rendered this pitted, pockmarked lunar landscape. It was also a highly virulent, contagious disease. And this importance of smallpox as one of history's greatest killers is rivaled by its significance as the subject of, quote, the world's most triumphant achievement in medicine and public health. The global dissemination of the vaccine led to the eradication of smallpox through a global worldwide campaign led by the WHO. It is to date the only human disease to be eradicated from the globe. Both China and India have very long histories of smallpox. They compete for the orientalizing moniker of the cradle of smallpox. Both had highly well-developed and surprisingly resonant systems of beliefs and practices around the disease. In line with the disease deities that existed across much of the world, China and India had smallpox goddesses, Toshen Nyang Nyang in China, and Sitala Mata in India. And the two goddesses are strikingly similar, as you can see, in their visual representations. In both China and India, there were traditional medical systems that saw smallpox as a disease of heat, and patients followed a cooling diet. Beginning around the 16th century, both China and India witnessed the emergence and spread of a new technique, which was embedded within and accompanied by these rituals: the prophylactic practice of variolation. Variola is the smallpox virus. In order to understand how variolation worked, let's think for a moment of how a vaccine works. The fundamental idea behind a vaccine is that if we are deliberately exposed to a relatively harmless or the dead version of a germ, our immune system will then recognize and eliminate that germ rapidly if it encounters it out in the world. This logic comes from the practice of variolation, which was an essential precursor to vaccination. Say you were a child in China or India at this time who was lucky enough to survive a case of smallpox. A variolator, usually an itinerant folk healer and not a classically trained physician, who charged quite a sum for their services, would collect some material from your smallpox sore. Remember, this is a key way in which smallpox spread, and then use these scabs to produce a mild but protective infection in other children. The technique differed. It was administered through nasal insufflation in China and cutaneous incision into your arm in India. So if I was a child being variolated in Canton, I would snort your scabs up my nose. And in Calcutta, the variolator would scratch it into my skin, very much like a modern-day vaccine. Both techniques were equally effective. So this technique of variolation was carried from China and India into the Ottoman Empire and introduced through the advocacy of a heroic lady, Lady Mary Montagu, into Britain. Variolation then spread across much of Europe, also to North America, and this innovation from Asia led to substantial decreases in mortality across other parts of the world. This is Edward Jenner, and he is credited with inventing vaccines. When he was 8, Jenner was inoculated like thousands of other children in England. Later, as a doctor in rural England, interacting closely with dairymaids who had a reputation for being specially beautiful, the reason they did not have a, quote, ugly, pock-marked face, they reported to Jenner, was because they were protected from smallpox because they had gotten cowpox. Now, exposure to cowpox was a pretty nasty disease if you were a cow, but it was quite benign if you were a human, and it protected you against smallpox. Jenner took this folk wisdom and replaced the variolous matter, the smallpox scabs that were used in variolation, with matter from the pustules of the cow. Voila! Variola vaccinae, Latin for smallpox of the cow, the world's first ever vaccine in 1796, which coined the term vaccine itself. Now this vaccine, cloaked in the colonists' language of spreading civilization, is sent back to China and India, homes of the indigenous knowledge upon which it was built. But from here on, from the time that the vaccine arrives in China and India at the beginning of the 19th century to the eradication of smallpox in the mid-20th century, it is two very distinct stories. In general, a far greater willing compliance with the vaccine in China than India. I use my comparative historical analysis of the cities of Canton and Calcutta in China and India during the 19th century and of the countries themselves in the mid-20th century to develop what I call a moral theory of compliance. What do I mean by this? A moral theory of vaccination has two components: the messenger, who is asking for compliance, and the message. How is compliance elicited? How is it framed? What is it that compliance is being sought for? This moral theory is rooted in a fundamentally different understanding of us and how we think and behave than the much criticized and yet dominant rational actor model. Homo economicus is a rational interest maximizer. In order to get Homo economicus to comply with the public health intervention, you just need to give her some more information about it. Costs and benefits, Homo economicus will tally this up, and if the advantages outweigh the risks, she'll roll up her sleeve. And yet we know that facts don't change our minds. Studies have shown that providing people more information about vaccines is not only often ineffective, it can actually backfire. In contrast, research in social psychology, but also increasingly in neuroscience, shows that we develop attitudes and take actions in much more complex ways. Unlike Homo economicus, who processes information in a neutral Bayesian manner and maximizes interests, Homo moralis thinks and acts in biased, motivated ways. So to return to my moral theory of compliance, who is asking people to vaccinate must have a relationship of authority, of trust, of legitimacy with the people. And the message matters. My research brought out how public health messaging is more likely to resonate if it fits with two sources of motivation: cognitive and affective, and I'll discuss each in turn. Let's begin with the cognitive. We strive as humans for cognitive consonance. We are more likely to accept new information, as the sociologist Leon Festinger said, if we can find a schema through which to link the stimulus to previously understood experiences. Amor Tversky and Daniel Kahneman famously had the familiarity heuristic, that a statement compatible with established beliefs or understandings, it feels more familiar. It leads to a sense of cognitive ease, and the statement is therefore more believable. Information that is not cognitively compatible, that constitutes a rejection of what we know, is more likely to in turn be rejected, at least initially. So in the city of Canton in Imperial China in the early 19th century, vaccination was willingly adopted, and a key reason for this was that it was promoted by the local gentry. The gentry are either state officials or they're closely linked to the state through their having been conferred a degree in the imperial exam system. But they also have strong ties to society. A system of Confucian norms and the mandate of heaven prompts the local gentry over many centuries to be responsible and accountable for the welfare of people. So they enjoy a long legacy of trust and authority. And the way that the gentry endorses this new Jennerian vaccine was by embedding it within traditional established ways of thinking about and treating smallpox. One of the ways that the gentry promoted vaccination was by writing prefaces for a vaccination manual written by one of the first vaccinators in southern China, Churchi, who had learnt the technique from the Surgeon General of the East India Company, Alexander Pearson. Churchi's manual was technically a translation of a manual written by Pearson, but the translation did a few things to creatively link the vaccine to the principles and practices of Chinese medicine. For one, Churchi got rid of this whole method of inoculation discovered in the Kingdom of England. So he changes the title. He adopts the writing style and the illustrations of traditional Chinese medicine texts. A further sinicization is that he adopts the same pre- and post-operative dietary and ritual protocols that had accompanied variolation. And finally, remember that variolation had happened in Canton through nasal insufflation. You're snorting the scabs up your nose. And now in the vaccine, there is an incision into the arm by a vaccination lancet that is radically new. Now, Churchi and the gentry who are endorsing his manual make this acceptable by linking it to the familiar needling technique of acupuncture. Vaccination manuals such as this use ornate illustrations in traditional drawing styles to show vaccinators how to make incisions along acupuncture meridians that corresponded with smallpox. The customary cooling diet was also maintained, and often the Jennerian vaccine was accompanied by traditional herbal formulas. In contrast, the vaccine meets with a far cooler reception in 19th century Calcutta. It arrives at exactly the same time in both Canton and Calcutta. It's introduced by the same agent, the East India Company. And these cities are key entrepôts in the European, especially the British trading system. In fact, trade between Calcutta and Canton, silver, tea, and eventually opium, is the lifeblood of British imperialism. And you can get a sense of the importance of the two cities from this painting of the three money brothers, all employed by the British East India Company, that was commissioned by their father, Mr. Money, where the fingers of Robert and James Money are pointing to Canton and Calcutta respectively. So Calcutta shares many socioeconomic political similarities with Canton, but unlike in Canton, the vaccine in Calcutta is resisted. An important reason is that British colonial officials do not have the same degree of trust or legitimacy as the gentry. Further, because the colonists' spread of vaccination was part of a civilizing mission, this led them to present the vaccine as something totally new and different from the established practice of variolation, especially the worship of Sitala, in which variolation was embedded. So variolation, which as I mentioned, was very effective and in fact formed the basis of knowledge on which Jenner built, was now described by the East India Company in Calcutta as backward and is dangerous. And yet, even though the technology of the vaccine was very similar to variolation, much more similar than in Canton, because people were accustomed to having an incision into their skin, yet most residents of Calcutta and the surrounding areas of Bengal avoided vaccination and continued to prefer variolation. In colonial documents, you repeatedly see reference to how a big reason for this was what medical historian David Arnold has termed the, quote, raw secularity of vaccination. And this is a quote from one of the vaccine reports that says that the principal objection to vaccination was that it was done without any puja or worship or sacrificial offering. Unfortunately, the bulk of my archival sources for this period are colonial documents, and these are unsurprisingly laced with the racist judgments of their writers, colonial officers in the service of the East India Company, like the Money brothers. And the resistance of Indians to the vaccine is attributed to their superstition, their prejudice. But in fact, the way in which vaccines were framed constituted a cognitive and cultural rupture with a cohesive, elaborate, and in many ways quite sophisticated system of understanding and treating smallpox. It's interesting to note here that many of the instances in Calcutta in which the vaccines were accepted was when they were accompanied by all the same rituals that had accompanied variolation. So middle-class households who could afford it chose an auspicious day for the operation. They observed the old rituals, the dietary taboos, they employed a priest, and as Arnold writes somewhat tongue-in-cheek, they thanked Sitala rather than Jenner Sahib for the child's safe passage. Fast forward more than a century, India in the 1970s at the peak of the World Health Organization's global smallpox eradication campaign. Smallpox has been eradicated in Africa. South Asia is one of the last outposts of the virus. And the WHO has shifted from a strategy of universal vaccination to what is known as surveillance containment. A zealous and committed cadres of Indian doctors and health workers and foreign epidemiologists are going from village to village to locate cases of smallpox and vaccinate all contacts in a ring to stop transmission of the virus. Now, if you read the report of this campaign, a somewhat dry document called The Management of Smallpox in India, it's dedicated to a spiritual leader, Neem Karoli Baba, by all accounts, an extraordinary mystic who was also the guru of Ram Das, Timothy Leary, Krishna Das. But how it was that this report, penned by a doctor from San Francisco, Dr. Larry Brilliant, came to be dedicated to Neem Karoli Baba, I'll let you figure that out. And the hint is that you might want to dig into the archives of the Long Now Foundation seminars. But if you read this report and other reports, you can see the importance of smallpox zero teams, as they were called, convincing local notables, religious leaders to endorse the vaccination, and how important this was for them to convince people to roll up their sleeve. Further, even though there was a substantial foreign and Western presence and role in the campaign, under the advice of culturally sensitive epidemiologists like Dr. Brilliant, they were very aware of the cultural mores and rituals associated with Sitala. Indeed, the smallpox zero teams realized that the families of smallpox patients might evade them, but they would never hide from the goddess. So they camped at Sitla mandirs to detect cases and convince family members to be vaccinated. And they often set up vaccination stations at Sitla temples. In doing so, they actively presented themselves as working with, indeed even devotees of the goddess Sitala, rather than working against her. By this time, smallpox had been effectively eradicated from China for about 2 decades. Communist China, Mao had taken power in 1949, was able to eradicate smallpox through a mass vaccination campaign in the early 1950s. So in line with that first messenger component of my moral theory of compliance, a large part of this success was because the vaccination campaign was launched by the Chinese Communist Party, who enjoyed a tremendous degree of legitimacy, having emerged out of decades of long, bitter fighting, first with the Kuomintang and then the Japanese. Vaccination had the full support of Mao, who was hugely popular in the 1950s. This is still well before the disasters of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. And at the grassroots level, it was communicated by the Communist Party cadres who were deeply embedded in and enjoyed the trust of local communities. Vaccination was part of the patriotic health campaigns. You were getting vaccinated to protect the health of your nation. And this gets to this second affective source of motivation in my moral theory of compliance. So I tried to present evidence for compliance because of cognitive motivations, that public health directives were more likely to be accepted if they were linked to our established beliefs, norms, and practices about sickness and health. But willingness to vaccinate and compliance with health interventions more broadly is also greater if it taps into our affective sources of solidarity. What I have in my previous writings called a sense of we-ness. Nationalism is a particularly potent form of we-ness. In my first book, I showed how feelings of national solidarity lead to a perception of a linked fate, a shared destiny which helps put in place social policies for the common good. Indeed, nationalism has been a powerful driver of popular mobilizations, against colonialism across Asia and Africa from the 40s to the 60s, against communism across Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union in the 1990s. And states have effectively drawn on this powerful motor of nationalism to encourage compliance with those tasks that present collective action dilemmas. Remember, getting citizens to pay their taxes, joining your army, and possibly laying down your life for your country. So in conclusion, compliance with public health interventions remains one of the most pressing challenges of our time. We can see this today in the challenges of attaining herd immunity against COVID, but before and beyond. In 2019, the WHO identified vaccine hesitancy as one of the top 10 threats to global health. Effectively addressing this challenge begins from a better understanding of ourselves, a humbler understanding. Homo moralis is a messy, motivated, emotional decision maker, but also a richer understanding. We are driven not just by maximizing our narrowly defined interests, but also by our perceptions of trustworthiness, legitimacy, by norms and values, by shared identities and solidarities. We are mere mortals, but we are also moral mortals, and this is our strength. Thank you.
Well, that was really fantastic. I'm here today next door to the Interval at the Hang Gallery, because now the Interval, our headquarters and bar and cafe, is now fully open. But I'd love to welcome Prerna Singh, who's joining us for the questions from her home in Providence, Rhode Island. Welcome, Prerna.
Thank you so much, Sanja. It's a pleasure to be here.
So great to have you. And I'm glad that you were able to do your fellowship out at Stanford during the summer, and we were able to record your talk here then. But also glad to have you here live from your home. And in a little bit, we're actually going to be joined by Dr. Larry Brilliant, who you featured in the talk and in your work. And really great to have him as both a previous speaker and as well as, as you mentioned, one of the people who led the efforts to eradicate one of the only truly eradicated disease. So I'm sure that would be great. I wanted to get into a couple questions that I have, and we'll also bring some questions in from our live audience. One of the first things I want to talk a little bit about is this Jenner story. I mean, he's often, he's credited as an inventor or a discoverer, and yet he really was bringing folk knowledge into a more common and modern practice. And how do you like to talk about invention versus discovery, and how these things get brought into I guess it would call the modern world?
I think it's a great question, Xander, and thank you for asking it. I always find it interesting. I forget exactly where I read it, which was talking about how Jenner is described in history books in different parts of the world. And of course, in British and European history books, he's described as the inventor of vaccines, even though we should keep in mind, and of course this links to the whole anti-vaccination, vaccine hesitancy question today that I'm sure we'll get to, is that at the time of his invention, Jenner was ostracized by the medical community within Britain, within England itself. So there was a lot of suspicion, a lot of doubt, a lot of hesitancy around the nature of this intervention that he had made, and it was a kind of leap of imagination for many to be able to kind of take this knowledge on board, even though, as you point out, it actually built on centuries of knowledge that had existed in India and China. So the point that I wanted to make is that his invention meets with a lot of resistance and is not automatically heralded as an invention. People call him a quack, even within England. On the other hand, I find it quite interesting that French encyclopedias of the time do not attribute to him the status of an inventor. They prefer to call it the discovery of vaccines. And I think that to some extent, of course, refers to the Anglo-French rivalry that has, of course, extended into science. But I think is also in some ways, I don't want to say more accurate, but at least an accurate bringing in of the fact that at this point in time, some of the early impetuses to colonialism were, of course, to collect materia medica and to understand the knowledge systems, which in China and India were far more sophisticated in many ways than the kind of heroic medicine of bloodletting that was dominant in Europe. And so to some extent, I think, invention, discovery, but also the kind of impetus of what was happening, just the geopolitics of colonialism of the time, and how quickly that shifted. So vaccines are so interesting historically because they really represented in many ways the first thing that kind of the Europeans had on the colonies, or so they thought, So this was a clear to them kind of something better than what existed. Of course, what that meant was that they had to completely discard and deliberately, in a way, undermine the knowledge upon which the discovery or the invention of the vaccine was built. And so suddenly variolation was backward, it was suspicious. I mean, of course, it was dangerous. The key thing about variolation was that, it would be the equivalent would be actually giving someone a case of COVID. A controlled case of COVID. But like COVID, because these are transmissible diseases, the danger was that it was transmissible in the way that, of course, you're not contagious when you get a vaccine. And so, of course, there were dangers associated with variolation, but in one fell stroke with the kind of colonial discovery, the British discovery, the Western European discovery, it suddenly became that, the knowledge variolation was painted as extremely dangerous, very backward. And so I think there are all these kind of politics in which kind of vaccination represents a really important moment, both for public health, but also for the understanding of geopolitics. And your question about invention versus discovery, I think gets right to the heart of it.
Indeed, I think that there's such an interesting nationalistic component to this, which we're now seeing with vaccine hesitancy having nationalist elements now with COVID. But so many technologies, whether it's it was astronomy or clockmaking, even were invented centuries earlier in the East, slowly got developed or migrated to Europe, and then were reintroduced and had so much hesitancy coming back in because they felt that there were these imperialist and colonialist pieces of information or pieces of technology. Even though almost all of them, I mean, as Kevin Kelly likes to point out, every single technology was invented in the East, aside from the scientific method, which somehow got missed. But I think there seems to be a history of this throughout time, and so we're now once again living through another version of where nationalism and science kind of do not agree with each other. So I really appreciate this as part of your work, and I mean it kind of gets us to this thing that you pointed out, which is this very sobering reality that facts don't change minds, and we often see people trying to use facts to change minds. But I think you really pointed out, both in Larry Brilliant's work and in this other work, that you kind of have to meet people where they're at. You have to people both physically and culturally. And I'd love if you could just talk a little bit more about that and maybe how that might apply better to the situation we're in now.
Yeah, so this is not heartening research in many ways, and I think it's research that also doesn't fit, as I said in the talk, our own kind of understandings of how we think humans should behave, right? And so I think that that's why I think it's difficult for us to take on board. And I still read these studies, even though I know them, with a degree of surprise of just how little giving people information. And much of this came before COVID with the MMR vaccine, which of course became the source of much controversy after a completely debunked Lancet article by Andrew Wakefield, but kind of has led to this residue of hesitancy. And of course, again, just rewind, it led to the outbreak of measles, for decades. Why is it that this information doesn't change our mind? And it gets, I think, to this alternate understanding of humans as decision makers who are motivated by moral concerns. And so I think, I kind of feel as if I want to kind of shift the debate and the attention away from the hand-wringing and the pessimism and frustration that often accompanies our reading of these studies that show that giving people more information about costs and benefits and risks and how safe vaccines are doesn't lead to that change in behavior that we anticipate. To kind of shift it to say that, well, let's then really emphasize what does change behavior. And historically, we have a rich repertoire of evidence about what does change behavior. And I would love to kind of, hear Dr. Brilliant kind of coming in on this at some point. But, the fact that in those very last stages of the eradication of smallpox, it wasn't necessarily that they were giving people more information about the disease. In fact, if anything, smallpox was a disease that was all too familiar to people. But I think, the way that I put it in the talk and the way that I talk about it in my book is about both the kind of cognitive and the affective. So both, where, as you said, where are we at in terms of almost everyone has certain sets of norms and understandings about what makes us sick and what's going to make us healthy. And I think kind of understanding what people think of as making them sick and making them well is really important. We know that there's an association in the US between people who believe in alternate forms of medicine and a certain degree of vaccine hesitancy. We knew this prior to the COVID pandemic. So again, trying to understand, what is their worldview? What is their understanding? And to meet that not with aggression or with skepticism or with hostility, but to kind of really meet it from a point of, meet that point of view from a stance of empathy. And then to kind of, bring that on board, as well as I said, so that's the message part of it. And the second part is, of course, who is doing this convincing? I think, the kind of the agent of persuasion has to be, and we've seen this again with COVID, someone who enjoys the trust, a degree of legitimacy on the part of the people. And that might be a state official, it might be your pediatrician, because most diseases, COVID is very different in some ways, because it's a actually unusual disease that we are vaccinating ourselves as adults. For most infectious diseases, we receive vaccines as children. And so I think, in some ways, the pediatrician or the doctor, so we have to kind of really work hard both into developing our understanding of a sympathetic understanding of people's repertoire, their norms about what constitutes sickness and healing, and then, the understanding what their kind of ecosystem of trust and authority and legitimacy is. And the final thing that I'll say before I turn it back to you, Xander, is that I think of nationalism here as both the promise, but also the pitfall of it. And I think we sometimes tend to talk about the drawbacks of nationalism, which are all too evident in the kind of tragic vaccine nationalism that continues. In India, where I'm from, there's still a huge degree of vaccine scarcity, and yet we have this vaccine abundance in the US. And much of this is a product of the kind of vaccine nationalism through which vaccines are being distributed against COVID. But I do want to kind of point out to that part of my research that shows how nationalism can be this affective motor. So if facts don't change our mind, what does, right? So having vaccines be linked to the way that we think about health and healing will change our mind, but also it being linked to this emotion, what are we motivated by emotionally? And I think their nationalism has been such a powerful motivator of humans historically since the beginning of the nation state. People have been willing to lay down their lives for the nation. And so I think, again, the experience of the patriotic health campaigns, but also the experience of Cuba and many other countries points to how nationalism can be mobilized as this very powerful affective tool, even though it remains this kind of very dangerous divisive force as well. So, you're right, information doesn't change our mind, but I want to kind of try to focus on what does change our mind and how we can take those lessons to our understanding of the present and the future.
Thank you. And this would be a great time to bring in Larry Brilliant. He's joining us from his home, actually not too far from us. Welcome, Larry.
Hello, Xander. Thank you for inviting me in. Prerna, that was wonderful, both your talk right now and your book and the film. I came away watching your talk with the same feeling I had when I read your book. How could one person know so much? It's really a pleasure to spend some time with you.
Thank you so much. I cannot tell you what an immense honor it is to have you join the conversation, and I'm so grateful to you.
So we're supposed to do some questioning and back and forth, but I thought first I would surprise you. I hadn't planned on this, but when you spoke about Shitala, I'm reminded that Shitala really had two different meanings in the Indian household. Frequently, when you would go to find cases of smallpox, whether you were an Indian or a Westerner, you would not be permitted in a house that had smallpox because someone might say Shitala is visiting us. Yes. And in that sense, Shitala was protecting. And at the same time, Shitala was synonymous in many parts of India with the bad parts of smallpox. And of course, there were Shitala temples all over and Shitala images all over. And earlier, before we began this, you mentioned a friend of both of ours, Mahendra Dutta, and he gave me a gift after we had eradicated smallpox. And I'm going to show it to you. And this is what's going to surprise you.
Oh, that's beautiful. I wish I had my effigy. My office in the Center for Advanced Study of Behavioral Sciences had a whole altar dedicated to Shitala. Oh, that's beautiful. But I think that's a testimony in some ways to what you managed to do, which is to kind of, I think exactly what I was saying to Xander, which is, to kind of understand that Shitala, as you said, was both a protector, a visitation, the Ma, you were possessed by the Ma was there with you, but also, of course, she was the one who was associated with having your having contracted smallpox. But to be able to understand that, I mean, I've heard these stories, legendary, of your kind of going through marketplaces with Sitala icons, you're camping at Sitala mandirs. But, I think that degree of cultural sensitivity, but also just understanding, as I was saying to Xander, what kind of the ecosystem of the understandings of sickness and healing were, and to be able to present vaccines as being within that rather than this kind of rejection of it, to me was such a critical component of the success, again, of the vaccination campaign against smallpox.
When you talk about meeting people where they are, probably no place in the world has there ever been more legitimate reason to have an anti-vax movement than India, because in order to make the vaccine, you had to take cows and imprison them and scarify their belly and implant pox and then harvest it and kill the cow. So in order to get the vaccine, the death of something sacred and honored and loved in India, a cow. So we encountered a tremendous amount of resistance. I wouldn't call it resistance. I think it was the right response. It was so ferocious that, as you know, the 1895 Bengal Immunity Act was created, one of the very few laws that was laid down because of the Calcutta aversion to being vaccinated. So when we were in the program and towards the end of it, when we felt that this reaction against the vaccine was understandable and legitimate, my wife Girija and I would stay in Shitala Ma temples. We would sleep in the temples. We would talk to the pujaris and we would say, look, what can we do? This disease is killing children. And they would say, well, that's not Shitala's intention. And we would talk about what was the intentionality of the deity. And in the end, we reached an understanding. And the understanding was the pujaris would say, listen, we have 7 other rash diseases that Shitala Ma is in charge of. Maybe we can help you with this one. And when I told him that my guru had said that the eradication of smallpox was God's gift to humanity, these pujaris said, let us help you. And they would take us to the villages. They would sign the posters. They would guide us to vaccinate people. They would show us where cases were. And we could not have eradicated smallpox without the help of Shitala Ma and her priests. It couldn't have been.
Absolutely. I think it's, every time I hear it, even though I've been in the archives for far too long, I've, read everything you've written, it's still such a poignant, moving story. And of course, it's resonant. If we go back to, if we again go back to this theme of learning from other pandemics, I keep going back to Ebola. And the fact that so much of the transmission was happening through funeral rituals, and much, the kind of advising of people to just stop laying their hands on the corpse was not enough until, as you kind of point out, they were able to get the buy-in, the support, the endorsement of the religious leaders, the clergy, who said, we can kind of send the spirits on without, the healing touch can happen, from afar. But I think that kind of careful cultural work requires, it requires institutions, it requires empathy. And, we were talking before we went live that the CDC, which is such a hollowed out institution, I mean, you were part of the CDC, you and the WHO epidemiologists were going across the world, because in a way, the battle against COVID is just, we're not even there in terms of in India. There is still so much vaccine scarcity. There's also a fair degree of hesitancy, and the international community, the US, the CDC, were so critical. They were at the vanguard of the eradication of this deadly infectious disease. And you were all there doing this kind of work. And so I can't help but think, this is the kind of work we need to be doing in the rural hinterland in the US, to be able to understand, what are people's belief systems? Who can we reach out to convince them? What are the messages that we can frame this within? And then how can we take this to other parts of the world, which are slowly going to begin to kind of move from a stage of vaccine scarcity to vaccine abundance and reluctance, the way that we have in the US?
So I ask you, as a historian, what major transformative social movement occurred without the religious institutions, without the churches. And then I asked the very tough question, which is right now about COVID, where are the churches? Where are the temples? Where are the synagogues, the mosques? Where is the religious community helping to vaccinate the country? 1/3 of the country is unvaccinated. 125 million Americans right now are completely vulnerable. And around the world, that number is probably close to 7 billion who are still vulnerable. We won't have enough vaccine, certainly not to waste. And the United States and the UK have purchased 3 times the amount of vaccine that we could ever use, even if we vaccinated everybody 3 times. So what will we do when India is creeping up to 3 or 4% vaccinated? How will we engage all of the most powerful feelings of nationalism and, in my mind, the religious and spiritual community? They've been absent from this battle.
Absolutely. And so I'm a comparative political scientist who takes a historical view to this. And unfortunately, those historical lessons are on the one hand quite evident, and on the other hand, the kind of taking up of that lessons, as you point out, Larry, is missing. So I think you're right, the kind of role of the clergy, that has the role of religious institutions, that's something that needs to happen. Of course, in India, that has become further complicated by the fact that, of course, the rise of Hindu nationalism means that religion has taken on a very different meaning than when you and Neerja, whose articles I've also read, I laugh every time I say it. They're just brilliant, right? I think that, so I worry, as you say, we begin to get to that point in other parts of the world, like in India, because that relationship, of people like me who are not necessarily on board with Hindu nationalism, how do those, it's become so, religion itself, much like in the US, has become so politicized, it has become so polarized that it's not so easy to kind of be able to take on board those religious leaders or religious ideas in the way that it was back in the 1960s and 70s. And so, I hate to kind of bring, to make this negative again a little bit, but again, the content of nationalism has changed. And so to me, the kind of challenge is this recovery, this kind of moral recovery of an idea of nationalism that stands above ethnic divisions and religious divisions, that can motivate people as a kind of patriotic duty, and to be able to find some idea of religion as spirituality rather than as these kind of religious institutions and political ideologies, to be able to, to me, like, vaccination is at once both a spiritual duty and a patriotic call. That's how smallpox was eradicated. It was a combination of spirituality and, religious leaders and norms and trust and nationalism.
And good science.
Indeed. Well, I want to
of course, the good science is the backdrop of all of this.
I want to thank you, Larry, for joining us. It's always good to see you. Before you leave, though, I want to touch on one subject that it's still, obviously being debated very much right now. And I think maybe the best way to put it, I know we're mostly talking about vaccines and how those work, but also I do want to touch on disease origin. And while this is, currently, gone back and forth in a debate, and does it matter how disease have origins, whether in synthetic, labs or in, places where they jump naturally? Is this an area that we need to care a lot about, or should we be mostly caring about this other side of it, of how we treat things? So Larry, I'll have you jump in on this before we sign off with you.
I think we should care a lot about it. And there's 2 meanings of the word origin in this sense. And I'm not talking necessarily about bioterrorism versus bioerror or naturally occurring. But the last death from variola major in the world, I talk often that I saw the last case of variola major in nature in the world, but the last death was a lab accident.
Yes.
In Birmingham, England, a woman, Janet Parker, in her 20s, a photographer who did nothing except have her office a floor above a lab that wasn't well protected in the ventilation system, wafted smallpox. So we need to understand, we didn't know that about smallpox. That was not part of our understanding of how smallpox spread. Right now, we need to understand the origin of COVID, not to blame anybody. Lab accidents are accidents, and they happen. But we need to understand how do we take care of the samples that will be left with us. The theory is that it was a BSL-2 lab, not a BSL-4 lab. If you saw the movie Contagion, you saw a BSL-4 lab, the kind of care that you have to take. We need to understand whether there are other bad forms of COVID in nature that will hit us not just with variants on this coronavirus, but other coronaviruses. Yes, we need to understand the origin, but not for the purposes of nationalism, not for the purposes of scoring points, but for understanding where this comes from and how we can prevent the next leap from animals to humans. And I'll just leave by saying every year there are 3 to 5 viruses that jump from animals to humans with pandemic potential. Unless we get together, bury the hatchet, so to speak, bury our nationalism, work together globally, solve these problems, the viruses are not going to stop coming. The question is, will we be, as one world and one species, ready for that?
Indeed. Well, we'll get Prerna's answer next, but thank you so much, Larry. It's really great to see you, as always.
Thank you for having me. Wonderful to see you.
Thank you so much.
Great. Well, and I want to get your opinion on this. I think it was actually a BSL-4 lab that that anthrax came out of purposefully, obviously, after 9/11. So, we're seeing both bioterror and bioerror coming out of these things. It always seems to me that when it comes to the part that we're in now, that it's largely irrelevant. We're talking about eradicating it, and it doesn't, in many cases, it really doesn't matter how it starts. But I think obviously looking forward, it does matter.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, to kind of bring in how geopolitics factors into this, I mean, Larry knows this all too well, is that, two smallpox samples were also kept, one in the Soviet Union, one in the US, under 7 layers of security, apparently, at the CDC. So, I think to me, the kind of critical point is I'm a political scientist. And I study germs and I study diseases, and I study them because in as much as they are a kind of scientific public health issue, they are a kind of deeply political issue. And I think this question also just kind of gets at that. But I do think that in some ways, Larry is right, is that this is not the first, it's not the last, pandemic potential, in this case, realized contagion disease that we have seen. And I think, to me, again, being able to distill those lessons and continue to implement those lessons and learn new lessons is essential if we are going to have a kind of hope at being able to kind of continuously improvise as these kind of germs morph.
Indeed. Yeah. Well, and it's, I think this idea, as he pointed out, this notion that none of these diseases have ever been eradicated without integrating religion and religious leaders into that, and how, sadly polarized that is in the COVID case at the moment. But I appreciate that by pointing it out, I think you're getting to, how we might have a shot at this. Kevin Kelly, one of our founders, often joins us on these, sent in a question that I thought would be interesting. Have you studied the difference in how well these types of things are accepted, of types of medicine are accepted that are injected versus pills, like oral pills? Is there a more or less accepted way of healthcare arriving to people? Is the injectable things just too scary?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is what is so interesting historically, and thank you for that question, because I think it allows me to emphasize a point that is that when the vaccine, that first vaccine, the Jennerian vaccine against smallpox arrived, it was actually much more of a break in southern China than it was in India for precisely this reason. There had not been a vaccine, or the kind of pre-knowledge of the pre-vaccine, the inoculation, the variolation was mostly done up the nose, nasal insufflation, or it was, in the way that unfortunately, tragically, the first act of bioterrorism here in North America happened, blankets, clothes of kind of smallpox patients. And so this idea of making an incision into the skin and injecting, again, as Larry said, animal matter into your skin was a big a big difference, a big potential disjuncture between the way that smallpox had been controlled previously, which is by, snorting something up your nose or kind of wearing someone else's clothes, combined with these herbal formulas and certain diets that accompanied this. But I think what's so critical, and I think to me, the short answer to the question is, I think it can matter, it need not matter. The critical thing is how it's framed and presented. And so to me, the kind of genius of these Chinese vaccinators, the gentry, the officials, was the way in which they linked this new incision into the arm with what they previously knew about incisions, which was acupuncture, which was very different. The lancet looked very different from an acupuncture needle. An acupuncture needle is really thinner than a human hair. And it was a very different mode of treatment. But to be able to kind of make that similarity, make that kind of cognitive bridge, which allowed what Daniel Kahneman, who was also a fellow at Caspis, to be able to say, that kind of cognitive link, that consonance that was created. And so in some ways, that kind of incision into the arm, the needle, could have been such a major stumbling block, but it wasn't, because of the fact that it was linked to this kind of existing centuries old, very trusted, very effective form of medicine. And to compare it to India, in some ways, they were used to an injection and incision, because that's how variolation had been happening for centuries before the arrival of the vaccine. So people were very used to a variolator who was called a tikadar coming out and making a little scratch on your arm, and it was often in the upper arm. So in a way, the technology was very, very analogous, and far more analogous in India than in China. And yet it was in India that the vaccine was resisted, because they could not make that bridge, because of what we began by discussing, is that now with this kind of civilizing colonial benevolence, vaccines had to be presented as something so new and so completely different, and as such a major improvement from this backward superstitious practice of variolation, is that they completely missed that opportunity to be able to link the technology. And that was actually a major problem, is they would, most of the actual vaccinators were Indian, because of course, Britain colonized India with a few hundred Scotsmen and Irishmen. And so, when the variolators were going and doing their rounds, and usually the British, the kind of monitoring official would stand on a little hillock, he could not actually tell whether the tikadar was performing a variolation or a vaccination, because the technology of incision was so similar. So I think that, to me, there's no necessary relationship between a kind of particular technology, whether that is a prick or up your nose. I once got the flu shot up my nose, which was quite new for me, even though it's actually a very ancient technology. So I think it's more the framing of the technology than the kind of science or the technology or the technique itself.
Interesting. Yeah, and how that might have played a role in culture up to that point.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, we're going to wrap up our questions, but we do have another one here from our YouTube thread from John. I think it's a very interesting question that's also linked to so many other kind of questions of science and how they get adopted by society. Vaccination, as well as something like climate change, they both have, ways of acting on them that may help fix them in the present. And as you mentioned, we are presentist, but we are discounting that future. But they also have this problem that, inaction can create very long-term bad consequences. And it's this odd question of how we balance inaction and kind of this wait and see attitude to taking action now and thinking that it's going to have a difference in the future. And I just wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about how we feel, kind of how society feels about inaction versus action in these cases.
Yeah, and I think this question about the future and how that plays into our decision making is obviously close to your heart and that of the Long Now Foundation. And I think that the key thing, again, that I kind of return to is to understand, again, the way in which, the way that we think about the future can change, again, depending on how it is framed and who it is that is presenting that information to us. And so, we all have visions of the future. It's what kind of motivates us in many ways, the kind of procreation, both our ancestors, but also our kind of descendants. And so I think that almost every civilization has had some idea of, being able to reach out to the future and kind of have this threat. So I think, to me, the key issue again is this question of how is it that we kind of link a present predicament to an understanding of the future? Who links it? And is that considered a legitimate, trustworthy linking? And so I think, again, there's a lot of research on climate change, a lot of political scientists who've shown that exactly the same scientific content presented by different institutions who enjoy varying degrees of authority and their framing in different ways can lead to drastically different attitudes on the part of otherwise similar people towards that kind of threat of climate change. And so I think, again, the future is just not one thing. The future is how we imagine it and how we think of it and how we find ourselves at this present moment linked to that idea of the future. And I think that's where the potential of a kind of creative construction lies. And I think, again, kind of understanding the socio-political foundations of trust, legitimacy, and authority, and of understanding how we process information is what allows us to make that link and present a particular vision of the future that would allow people to be more alert, more cognizant, and more active about a very real and present threat to our descendants from climate change. But, we can also see climate change around us today. So, to me, it's, as a kind of constructivist, so much of this is the kind of creative construction as it relates to structures of authority in the kind of society that we live in.
Thank you. And last question. Now that you're back at home with your family, is what's next for you? What's your next project? What are you researching now?
So getting this book done and out is very much so my future right now is not the long now is for me the kind of getting this book out, because in some ways I began working on this book when vaccination and infectious diseases are very unsexy topics. It's kind of like,
before it was cool. Yeah.
Before it was cool. So I've been working on this for far too long. And in some ways, I think, it has become tragically relevant today, but just the archives can immerse you. There's always so much more, but I do think I have something quite important to say. And so the challenge for me is really to be able to kind of get it written. And so it's a more immediate future. And then, of course, questions of public health and nationalism and kind of remain, I think, somewhere in that kind of more longer future.
Nice. Well, I'm glad that you started as early as you did, so you would be ready to talk to us at such a relevant moment. And thank you so much. Really, really appreciate having you.
No, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
And I'd love to thank Dr. Larry Brilliant, who joined us as well as our production team. We have some talks coming up in the future, some of our first live talks in over 18 months. And some of those are going to be covering similar subjects, such as how quarantines have worked. And I would love to thank our venue here, the Hang Gallery next door, for hosting us for this Q&A. And I look forward to seeing you all at our next talk. Thank you so much.